founding editor of Unpious, an online platform for voices and views generally suppressed in Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox publications. He serves as a board member at Footsteps, a New York City-based organization that offers assistance and support to those who have left the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. His writing has appeared in the Jewish Daily Forward, Salon, the Brooklyn Rail, and others. And tonight we are celebrating the release of his new book, All Who Go Do Not Return, a memoir about growing up in and then leaving one of the most insular Hasidic sects in the U.S. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Shulem Deen.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sarah. So, first of all, thank you all for coming. This is a really big night for me. And I think we all dream of like having our Oscar speech, and I think we all dread having to listen to somebody else's Oscar speech, especially if it's just a book reading. But I do have to really briefly thank a whole number of people, too many people, but I hope I can, just some at least. Finn Reese has been the best pal I could ever have hoped for, and he's here tonight, even though the world of international shipping does not cease for book readings, and so I'm really grateful for that and so many other things. Jill Shulman is here from South Africa all the way. We've been friends for many years, and she had read my blog 12 years ago and wrote me right after saying, Shulem, you will be a writer one day, and you'll write a book, and I will be at your first reading and remind you that I told you you will write a book. And she reminded me of this yesterday. So I'm really grateful, and she's been a terrific friend for a dozen years now, and I'm really, really, really grateful that she's here. I want to thank, my agent couldn't be here. He's traveling, Rob McQuilkin, but he is everything that I could have imagined an agent would be. He is a tireless and fearsome champion. He's simply the best, and I hope we'll get this on video, and he will see this online. My editor, Katie Dublinsky, was just a tremendous editor, unbelievably patient, insightful, and gave me such incredible guidance. Everybody else at Grey Wolf, which is a just one of the best publishing houses that I can imagine, especially since it's the only one I've ever published with, but they're just phenomenal, every single person there. Erin Kotke, my publicist, and the marketing team, Marissa, Sarah, and Fiona McRae, the executive director, is just terrific. I cannot start reading or doing anything else before thanking Footsteps. If you guys don't know about Footsteps, Footsteps is an organization that assists those who leave the ultra-Orthodox community. Yes, big applause. Footsteps has been tremendously, tremendously helpful to so many of us who have left, to me, and so many others, and I can't even begin to count the ways. If you do anything else, buy the book, but after you buy the book, if you've never heard of Footsteps, look them up on the internet, support them, get on their mailing list. There's not a single cause in the world that I feel more passionately about, and I am. It's an incredible honor that I also serve. I'm a member of Footsteps, and I also serve on the Footsteps board. And so big shout out to Lonnie, the executive director, who is just absolutely amazing. I'm astounded every single day at the work she does, and the people who help her, Rachel, Betsy. I'm sorry that I'm forgetting so many others. There's so many. It's just a crazy good organization, and every single person there. And Malky Schwartz, who started it, and Michael Jenkins, who'd been there for so long, and I owe him a special thank you. The Footsteps community, the people, they've been my surrogate family, my friends, everything. The broader OTD community, OTD, for those of you who don't know, off the derech, the people who've left. They are our family. So many of us have lost families. We've lost really important connections, and the OTD community has come together, and we serve as family for each other. We celebrate birthdays, weddings, births, college graduations, and all that, holidays together. The Unpious readers, Unpious, some of you might know, was a website that I ran for a number of years, which was a really satisfying project, although we haven't been publishing lately. But I specifically want to thank those who contributed to Unpious, an incredibly talented list of writers who have then gone on to do incredible things of their own. Leah Vincent, many of you know, wrote a superb other book called Cut Me Loose, and you should all check that out. Others who have gone on to write and have bylines in other places: Fremont Goldberger, Frida Wiesel, Ari and Ellie Mandel, Loser Tversky, and they've all been tremendous inspirations, and there must be a number of others that I'm forgetting, but please forgive me. But all these people have been tremendous, tremendous inspirations. Before I start reading, I want to say one thing about the book. The book is a sad book. This is a celebratory event. Now, the book is a sad book not because my life now is sad. The book ends in a sad way, as some of you might know, especially those who've been following my writings. But it feels important for me to note at the beginning that while I'm celebrating something that is really momentous for me, I got to write this book. I came from nowhere. I mean, I considered that coming from nowhere, had no very little education, and I had to teach myself how to write. And this book was not nearly so much about telling my story as it was about creating and writing a really good book. So this is a celebration for me, but the story is a story of something that involved tremendous loss, and that loss to some degree is irreplaceable. As many of you know, I don't have a relationship with my children now, and that has been an incredibly, incredibly painful experience to go through. And so those of you who know about Jewish tradition, there's a tradition that before we have a celebration, we remember the destruction of Jerusalem. I am a secular, I'm an atheist, I'm Jewish, but I'm not Israeli. I love Jerusalem, but I don't necessarily pray for it to be rebuilt. But Jerusalem in a metaphoric sense can mean your own Jerusalem where you know, you have your own redemption and you find your home, and the people who are important to you come back to you. And so I remember the fact that I suffered tremendous loss, and I hope that one day I will have my Jerusalem again, and I just need to note this before I celebrate something that is a really happy occasion for me. And so, without further ado, I'll start some of the reading. And sorry if that went a little bit longer than I thought it would. I'm going to try to stand. I was in the middle of doing laundry when I was told of the girl I was to marry. I was a student at the great yeshiva of New Square when the washing machine in the dormitory stopped working and students scattered to the homes of friends and relatives to do their laundry. I dragged my laundry bag to the home of the Greenblatts, family friends who lived at the edge of the village. My father had died several years earlier, and my mother was still trying to rebuild her life after my father's death. So the Greenblatts were standing in as family, providing meals, laundry services, and the kind of meddling ordinarily reserved for family members. It was close to midnight, and Berish and the children had long gone to bed. The only sounds were of Chanamiri finishing chores in the kitchen, cabinets gently opening and closing, the careful clinking of dishes being placed in the sink, running water. Soon these sounds died down, and I heard the soft tap, tap, tap of Chanamiri's slippers as she came toward the laundry room, near the stairway to the bedrooms upstairs. I imagined she was heading to bed. I'd let myself out, as I often did. Chanamiri appeared in the doorway to the laundry room, and I raised my head in her direction without meeting her gaze. She wasn't family. To look at her directly was forbidden. From the edge of my peripheral vision, I could see the cloudy image of a diminutive female form, a kerchiefed head, a shapeless floral print house dress. "Did Berish tell you about the shidduch?" she asked. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the motion of the iron. Chanamiri was silent. "Well," she said finally, "Berish can give you more details tomorrow, but I might as well tell you now." She paused and then said haltingly, I know this might not sound like a great proposal, but give it some thought. I nodded as I moved the iron across the white polyester fabric, watching the soft creases disappear under the gentle hiss of steam. I was hoping to appear nonchalant, although I felt my heartbeat quicken with a tick of excitement. Chaim Goldstein's daughter, Chanamiri said finally. I must have looked crestfallen because Chanamiri's next words were, I know what you're thinking, but it's not as bad as you think. I didn't know the girl, but I knew her male family members. Chaim Goldstein was a portly man who prayed exuberantly and unselfconsciously in the back row of the shul. During Friday night services, I would see him making his way through the synagogue aisles, silver snuff box in hand, while the cantor's twirling voice filled the high-ceilinged sanctuary. Shuffling from table to table, he would offer worshippers a pinch of his peppermint-scented snuff, while behind him trailed 3 of his young sons with unkempt sidelocks, mud-crusted shoes, snotty noses. He was not the kind of man I imagined as my father-in-law. And I turned away now, not wanting Chanamiri to see my disappointment. I thought also of Nucham Goldstein, Chaim Goldstein's son. I remembered a day when, my study partner absent, I had asked Nucham to be my partner for one study session. This was during my first year at this yeshiva, and I thought it kindly to reach out to the boy who sat day after day without a study partner, idling over his Talmud, drumming his fingers on the table for hours, never once letting his gaze fall to the open volume before him. Nucham seemed to have little aptitude for Talmud study. In fact, I'd never before encountered a partner like him. Why did the sages ask all these questions if they already knew the answers? He asked, as if the entire form was unfamiliar, as if he hadn't been studying Talmud since the age of 6 like the rest of us. It's a process, I said, scarcely believing I was having this conversation. Why does the process matter? He asked, scowling and indignant, as if personally affronted by the sage's lack of consideration, putting him through the grind and toil of rediscovering conclusions that surely ought to have been known by now. Why don't we just study the conclusions? It was a startling question, and I felt bad for this boy, who was clearly not enjoying his time at the yeshiva. But what I felt mostly was contempt. He was asking that which we knew must not be asked. Was he so dense not to know that? I know what you're thinking, Chanamiri said again now. You know her father, you know her brothers, but I was told she's different. She stood in the doorway, and the silence hung heavy between us. What's her name? I asked finally. Gitti, she said, all too eager. Gitti Goldstein. Gitti, from the Yiddish, git, good. It had a pleasant ring, suggested femininity, innocence, devotion. But still all I could think was her family, Chaim's simple-minded mannerisms, the dim look on Nucham's face, the little boys following their father at the shul, shy and timid, as if aware, even at that young age, that some people were more worthy than others, and that they, by virtue of some arbitrary social code, had been placed among a lower class. I need time to think about it, I told Berish the next day. I said the same to my mother after Berish asked her to speak to me. Only Chanamiri seemed to understand, but still, she thought, I shouldn't dismiss it. She's different from her brothers, Chanamiri said. I hear she's very normal. I'm going to skip a little part. It's just some background info. What is wrong with Chaim Goldstein's daughter? Berish asked a few days later. I said only that I needed more time to think, unable to formulate the torrent of thoughts into words. She has everything a wife should have, Berish persisted. What's to think about? I didn't know what there was to think about. If at first I wasn't drawn to this match because I wasn't drawn to the girl's father or her brothers, I soon found myself wondering about the girl herself. But the questions I had in mind couldn't be asked aloud. I wondered, was she pretty? Was she intelligent? Was she thoughtful and charming with a pleasant smile and an endearing laugh, or did she have none of those qualities, and maybe even decidedly unpleasant ones? I wondered if I might ask for a photo of the girl, but since none was offered, I thought it would be improper. I imagined that Berish and the matchmaker and the girl's family would wonder, what kind of boy is this who needs a photo of a girl before deciding to marry her? I hear she's very sweet, my mother said after making her own inquiries. The fourth child of 12, takes very good care of her younger siblings. That says a lot. She'd make a good wife and mother. She's very social too, my mother added brightly. Attends weddings and other family celebrations. She joins in the dancing. She has friends. She's very well spoken of. When none of these bits of information had the desired effect, Berish suggested the obvious solution. Why not ask the Rebbe? Of course, the Rebbe. The Rebbe would have the answer. Late one night, several days before Hanukkah, Berish and I went to seek an audience with the Rebbe. The Gabbai Reb Shia, the Rebbe's elderly secretary, sat in his office adjoining the Rebbe's chamber. While several dozen Hasidim waited in the large, brightly lit waiting room, pacing nervously, reciting psalms, or brooding in silence. Reb Shia wrote my kvittel, a request note, scribbled onto a small white square of paper, and ignored Berish's query of how long the wait would be. Hour after hour passed, as one after the other the men were summoned for their turn with the Rebbe, soon emerging with smiles for the surly door attendant, slipping $10 or $20 bills into his palm, now pleased, their hearts and minds unburdened. Finally, Berish and I were ushered in. I'd only been to see the Rebbe for hurried blessings and rushed handshakes, never for advice on a personal matter. Now, for the first time, I was to make a decision based on the Rebbe's guidance. It was a comforting thought. This was the special privilege of the Chassid, having access to the divine inspiration channeled through the tzaddik, the perfectly righteous individual. The Rebbe sat at the head of a long table on an elaborately gilded chair upholstered in rich blue fabric. I could see him observing the door, fingering a gold pocket watch. His forehead was misty with sweat, his stout frame and graying beard appearing so close, so lifelike, unlike in Shul, where he seemed only a blurry impression beheld from afar. Strewn across the table were piles of request notes from earlier visitors, mixed with the traditional money gifts, $20, $50, and $100 bills. "Nu, Geishoin," the attendant shoved my arm when I hesitated at the door. "Go already." There was no time to be awed. Others were waiting. Berish stood off to the side as I handed the Rebbe the kvittel and watched as he read it. Shulem Aryeh, the son of Bracha, for blessings and redemptions. Berish took a step closer and told the Rebbe why I had come. A girl was proposed, and I was here to seek the Rebbe's advice. The Rebbe looked at me for a moment, and then, with a flash of recognition, grew animated. "Ah, yes, of course. He'd been consulted about it by the other side," he said. "A good match, a wonderful match. Yes, wonderful, isn't it?" The Rebbe smiled, his eyes twinkling, crinkling along the edges. "He isn't sure," Berish said softly. "He has some doubts, some questions about it." The Rebbe regarded me from above his gold-rimmed eyeglasses and raised his bushy eyebrows with a look of surprise. "Questions?" he asked. "What kinds of questions?" What were my questions? Here I stood in front of whom we called the righteous foundation of the world, who was asking me to tell him why I might not want a match he had already declared wonderful. I looked from the Rebbe's inquiring eyes to the heavy brocade tablecloth to the piles of kvittlach, but the words did not come. It was then that I realized I didn't have questions, not really. I didn't want this match. I knew in my heart it was not the right one, that the things that were not said about Gitti Goldstein were as significant as those that were, and that I was unlikely to hear anything that would change that. Perhaps I'd been hoping that the Rebbe would tell me something new and delightful about this match, but what I really wanted was permission to refuse it. I wanted the Rebbe to say that if I didn't want it, it was okay, that something better would come along. and that saying no was not shameful or cruel, even as I knew that Gitti Goldstein was at that moment anxiously awaiting word from the matchmaker. I wanted the Rebbe to tell me that I didn't need a reason to say no, but a reason to say yes. But the Rebbe had already declared the match wonderful. One didn't tell the Rebbe what one wanted to hear. One listened and accepted. The Rebbe waited with raised eyebrows, then looked back at the kvittel in his hand, then back at me. Chaim Goldstein is a very fine man from a very fine family. And, the Rebbe added, he'd heard very good things about the Karen. The Karen is a good Karen, the Rebbe said. Karen is the principal sum in a financial investment. And it took me a moment to grasp what he meant. But of course, the Rebbe wouldn't say girl, a word so blatantly feminine that to speak it was improper. Instead, the girl was the Karen, the principal. This investment, the Rebbe was saying, was a good investment. It's a good thing, this Karen, the Rebbe said again, and waved his hand with a sweeping, exuberant motion. A good Karen, a fine Karen, nothing to worry about. He reached for my hand with his fingertips. May the one above bestow you with good graces. May the match be concluded favorably. Several days later, I sat in the back seat of a car on the way to the home in which my bride and I were to meet. It was early December, the third night of Hanukkah, and a snowstorm had come early that year. Snowdrifts were piled along the side of the road, and I watched as children sledded down a driveway on Lincoln Avenue. Nervous? Berish asked from the front passenger seat. I shrugged, avoided his gaze. I wasn't nervous, not in the way that he meant it. I'd been told they want me. I wasn't concerned about being rejected. The car pulled over to the curb. The front door of the house was slightly ajar, and through a thin curtain I saw people milling about inside. My mother, in the foyer when I entered, looked at me with what looked like forced cheer. She's a lovely girl, she said, smiling. There was a hint of sadness in her voice, as if she sensed the heaviness I felt. But she too knew that refusing the match was no longer an option. The Rebbe had given his blessing. There was nothing left to say. Chaim Goldstein appeared from one of the back rooms. He smiled and shook my hand, and then he and Berish led me into the dining room with my mother following behind. The girl, my future bride, stood at the far side of the table next to her mother. Her hair was short and curly, dirty blonde. Her clothes were simple, a long pleated skirt, a V-neck button-down sweater over a white blouse and ruffled collar. She looked away as I entered, and only after a moment did she let her eye wander towards me, offering a stiff smile, then looking away quickly. Our elders left the room, and Gitti and I sat down on opposite sides of the table. For the past 5 years, all conversation with girls had been forbidden, and it felt odd being in a room alone with a girl, vaguely inappropriate. I'd been told it was my role to initiate conversation, but the strangeness of the circumstances left me bewildered. For a minute, I couldn't think of a single thing to say. Smile from ear to ear, a friend had said to me earlier that evening. I'd confided that I was having my show that night, and I needed some tips. Smile from ear to ear, the whole time. You have to show her you're happy to be there. The whole time? From ear to ear, the whole time. He was certain of it. I wasn't sure what to make of his advice. Smiling from ear to ear would require an unnatural stiffening of the facial muscles, which would be impossible to maintain for the full 15 minutes of our meeting. Also, I thought it would make me appear insincere. It was all the advice my friend had to offer. He'd used it himself, he said, and he could vouch for its success. When I asked for topics of conversation, he said, talk about anything. But what does one talk about to a girl who's never studied Talmud, never attended a Rebbe's Tish, whose life, in fact, seemed so far removed from mine that we could not possibly have anything in common? My friend didn't know. He wasn't sure. He no longer remembered, really. His own meeting was so many months ago. Anyway, he said, in his case, the girl did most of the talking. Gitti, however, was not doing much talking at all. Fumbling for conversation topics, I finally asked about matters I already knew, whether she was still in school, how many siblings she had, whether she wanted to remain living in the village after our wedding. No, she shook her head. She'd already graduated some months earlier. 11 siblings, she mouthed in a barely audible whisper. Yes, she nodded. She wanted to remain living here. I offered a few remarks about myself. I said that I hoped to continue my studies after we married, at least for a couple of years. She nodded in response. It was a given. 2 years of study was mandatory for all married men in the village. She kept her eyes downcast at the table in front of her. When she glanced at me at one point, I quickly flashed the ear-to-ear smile my friend had advised, and she returned it stiffly. I thought she might offer a few questions or remarks of her own, but she seemed to have none. Soon I ran out of questions, and we sat in silence until Chaim Goldstein entered the room. Are you done? He asked. It wasn't a question. Clearly we were done. I'd imagined a 15-minute meeting, but this couldn't have been more than 7 minutes. I was relieved it was over. We rode to the Rebbe's home a short distance away, Gitti and I in separate cars. A few close friends and relatives milled about and greeted me cheerfully. They'd been notified already, and they seemed happy for me. The Rebbe's attendant smiled too, his usual gruff manner set aside for this joyous occasion, a new engagement. The men entered first and the women followed, while the Rebbe smiled and waved his hand in a gesture of joy. The men gathered around the table, clearing a space so that the Rebbe had a view of the bride, who stood among the women against the far wall. The attendant closed the door. Mazel tov, the Rebbe said. May it be a steadfast union. May you merit lasting seed to bring forth upstanding and blessed generations. The engagement was final, the Rebbe's blessing like a judge's gavel. The attendant placed a small tray of chocolate pound cake in front of the Rebbe, and the men lined up to receive their portions from the Rebbe's hand while the women watched from the edge of the room. The men sipped from small cups of wine and lined up for blessings of l'chaim, to life. As the person of honor, I was first, and the Rebbe held my fingertips for a long moment, mumbling a blessing, the same one he'd mumbled to thousands of grooms before me. It felt cold and impersonal, the Rebbe's eyes shifty and restless, as they searched for and then lingered on my bride, as if to include her from afar. I told myself that this is what I truly wanted. The Rebbe had approved of the match. I told myself that I was pleased with it, that I must be pleased, because clearly the Rebbe was pleased. I told myself what we, the Rebbe's followers, always told one another. The Rebbe cares about us more than we do ourselves. Our joyous occasions bring him more joy, our sad occasions more sorrow. I believed this, had repeated it to myself countless times, had made myself believe this. I knew it must be so. Thank you. I guess this is the question and answer portion now. Yes.
How old were you when this was taking place?
This lady here asked how old I was. I'm sorry, I didn't set it up. I had intended to, but I forgot. I was a month short of 19. Actually, I was 18. I got married when I was a month short of 19. When this happened, I was 18. Yeah, and my wife had just turned 8. My ex-wife, my bride then, she had just turned 18 that December. Yeah. Yeah.
When did you know that someday you would have to tell the story?
That's a good question. I you know what, this might have been one of the first pieces I worked on when I started writing the book 5 years ago. But I don't think I thought of it as a story until I started writing. Yeah.
Right. Would you be willing to discuss briefly, like, the process of crafting these stories, which have been in your head for years, like actually getting them down on paper?
The process of crafting these stories. Wow.
In brief, of course.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a process. I wish I'd had a process. It would have maybe not taken 4 years to write. I didn't know what I was doing when I started writing. I had absolutely no idea. I'd been a blogger, not a writer. I didn't think I could write a book-length project. My agent apparently believed that I could. And I'm very grateful that he did, but I had no idea what I was doing. I just started writing. Eventually I learned and I figured out how to do these things, and I did a lot of reading to sort of reverse engineer the writings of other writers I admired. But it took a long time to find writers that I actually admired and felt that I could learn from them. So it was... Yeah, I don't know what the process is. The process of writing is basically you have a story and you write it down. And if you don't have a story, then you can start writing and the story would come sometimes. Sometimes it happens. This story was fairly easy to write though. So yeah, I mean it was there. It's very tellable. This part. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Yeah.
Who are some of the writers that you do admire?
Well, eventually I learned a lot from Tobias Wolff, who wrote This Boy's Life, and I really learned a lot from the way he used his memoir. His storytelling technique was very instructive, as was Frank Conroy, who wrote Stop Time. And some people might know Frank Conroy I think he was the head of the Iowa Writers Workshop, or the first head of it. And the Iowa Writers Workshop, as some people might know, is the premier writers workshop in the country, or MFA program for writers. But really, my favorite writer, although I can't say I've read that much of his, I wish I'd read more of his novels, but James Baldwin's essays are just tremendous, and I read them over and over again. And it taught me a lot. And James Baldwin taught me how to write in a way that was more natural and less artificial. James, as people who are familiar with James Baldwin's essays, he has a lot of parentheticals, and his sentence structure isn't always what an editor would think is the best sentence structure, but he allows himself to do that, and that said to me that you could try something a little bit different that seems a little bit that has a different rhythm but could work. And that worked a lot. And I mean, his prose is just simply stunning. So yeah, that was really good. Michael, you raised your hand.
That was my question.
Oh, okay.
In terms of what's the response been from the Orthodox community?
Well, there hasn't been much. Here and there, a couple angry tweets. That's pretty much it. Nobody's really said much. I mean, I'm sure there's some people in this room who are Yiddish speaking and might know that there's a website called kavashtibel.com, which is the Yiddish word for coffee room, and it is one of the very few places on the internet where Hasidim actually hang out and have conversations in Yiddish, which you would otherwise have to go to a Hasidic synagogue to listen to. But over there, they've had some discussions about me and about my book. But the thing about that forum is that I occasionally pop in and have conversations with them, and they're surprisingly respectful and interested in my life, because I really am one of them. I speak their language. I speak aside from writing English, I used to write in Yiddish, and so I still write in Yiddish. And I think they were a little bit surprised when I started writing, because they saw me as a little bit more distant from the kind of what we would call the Hamish Yiddish conversations. And I think so there's a kind of respectful attitude there. And I know that we actually have some Kava Stiebel members in this room, and I got a glimpse of somebody sort of grinning in the back. So, but they're secret. Like people, it's they're all pseudonyms, and they're very paranoid about it. So, Don't ask me.
You
Yeah.
described yourself as an atheist at the beginning. Was that a straight shot, or did you try to find some middle ground somewhere?
If it was a straight shot of going from a Hasidic lifestyle to atheism, atheism is not a comfortable term for me. Atheism is a term that I use just for lack of a better one. I'm not sure that this is the best forum for this conversation, but just really, really briefly, I would say I heard on a this podcast. I forget what the name of it is. Something nerds, science people, and so this woman said something really interesting, and I thought it was very insightful. The question of whether God exists or not is an unknowable. There's no way that we can know the answer to that, which means that all of us are technically agnostics, whether we want to admit that or not. We are, in a very technical sense, none of us knows. There are atheistic agnostics, people who don't know what they say. I'm pretty I lean towards God's non-existence, and there are theistic agnostics who will say, they don't know because nobody can know, but they lean towards the idea that God does exist. So I thought that was a very insightful way to put it, because really there is no such thing as being a theist because you can't know it for certain, and there's no such thing really technically as being an atheist in the sense that you know that God doesn't exist. You can feel pretty strongly in the same way that you feel that anything else is certain, but there's no testable. There's nothing in an empirical sense that could prove to you God's existence or not. So, I'm not sure how I got to that. You asked if I went directly to it. The answer is no, I didn't go directly to it. It took some time. I'd stopped being a believer in Orthodox Judaism before I gave up my belief in God. I gave up my belief in the biblical narrative as history before I gave up, and the idea of revelation, before I gave up the idea of God's existence. I see them as somewhat separate. Some people don't, but I see that as separate questions. God can exist, but who says we know what he wants? And then separate from that, there's a question of whether he exists, which I believe he does not. So, yeah. Yeah.
What parts of the story were most challenging for you to tell, or maybe most painful for you to tell, and also were there aspects that you purposefully left out of the book?
The most painful part, it's fairly easy. The end of the book, am I too close to this? The end of the book was about the experiences that I had trying to maintain a relationship with my children, which was ongoing as I was writing. And to a very real degree, I hadn't gotten a certain distance that I felt that I usually feel that I need in order to write well. I'm not a believer in writing as therapy, or I believe write as therapy, but it doesn't make very good reading. And so I think the best writing comes when you've already processed difficult feelings, difficult experiences, that you've already gotten your anger and your bitterness out, and you can sort of be more reflective and insightful about it. And there were parts at the end that were very difficult for me to do because of that reason, because I was still very, very, very angry, and still dealing with those things, often on a kind of day-to-day or week-to-week basis. So those were the most difficult. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Joe.
Was there ever a time when you thought that some particular parts of your story would require too much exposition for a universal audience, that it wouldn't be instantly translatable and therefore make really bad?
That's a good question. I mean, bringing the Hasidic world to a broad audience is a challenge, right? I mean, it's a world that it requires a lot of explaining, and if you want it to be a compelling narrative, you have to do the exposition well. It was a challenge. I never thought that the challenge was. I never thought that I wasn't up to the challenge. I always knew that it was something that I had fairly good instincts for. One of the things that I didn't do is I didn't provide a glossary, and I also don't give any parenthetical translations of any of the words. This was kind of a point, and my editor and I had discussed it, but I felt really strongly that as a narrative work, this should this should be self-contained. You shouldn't have to sort of go to the back and look up words or go to footnotes, unless you're David Foster Wallace. You can get it footnotes, but otherwise, I think it's best to keep it all like within the text. So, yeah, but that was challenging, but that was a fun challenge.
About 30 years ago, I live in Bensonhurst.
Yeah.
So I went down to a bakery in Borough Park, 16th Avenue, and I witnessed a battle between two Hasidic groups, both with bats.
30 years ago.
30 years ago, 25. I forget sometimes when it happens, but I remember they were fighting each other. Really, I said, what's going on here? Then I was told that the people in Eastern Parkway don't get along with the other.
Right.
Could you repeat the part that you
I'm going to repeat it.
I found this very puzzling because. What was it all about?
What was going on? So what's your question? What was going on?
Yeah.
Okay, this gentleman here, he lives in Bensonhurst, he said, and 30 years ago this was in Borough Park? You went to
Park, yes.
Borough Park.
Around 15th Avenue.
He found himself in Borough Park on 15th Avenue somewhere, and so two groups of Hasidim battling each other with baseball bats and just like...
It's scary.
Now, yes, it's scary. I don't know what that particular incident was, but the Hasidic world 30 years ago was somewhat different from the Hasidic world today. Violence was not unheard of in the Hasidic world. I mean, violence was in some parts it's still used in certain ways. In my book, there are incidents of violence that are, in hindsight, pretty awful, but also pretty surprising that they were done. But just 5 years ago, there was an attempt to burn somebody's house down in the village of New Square, where I'm from, and the house didn't burn down. Luckily, there was a whole family in there, but there was a man who got burned, third-degree burns on 50% of his body or something. These things are still done. They're not officially sanctioned by any leadership, although leadership tends to be very very mealy-mouthed about condemning it. So, but violence is something that was there, and there used to be a lot of animosity between different Hasidic groups. There were, particularly the Satmars back 30 years ago. The Satmars were angry at everybody. The Satmars hated the Belzers, the Lubavitchers, the Vizhnitzers, the Klausenbergers. I'm sure there are some people here who can give a better history of that, but yes, there used to be a lot, but now those things don't really happen. The intergroup tensions are a lot less these days, I think.
Was it because of theology?
No. Well, some of it. It might be a little bit an involved conversation to get too deeply in it, but mostly it was not because of philosophical differences or ideological differences. Mostly they were just petty, just pettiness. I think that's true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel that you had a choice to follow this path, or was it something you just had to do?
To follow the path
that you chose?
To leave? If I had a choice to follow it, it was a choice. It was a choice. It was not something, it was not inevitable. I could have chosen to stay. I could have chosen to stay within the Hasidic community, but I felt like I had to leave for my own sanity. I didn't know how it would end up. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know that I would lose as much as I lost. But it was a choice. It was a very, very conscious decision that I made, and I remember making it and saying to myself, okay, my decision is I will leave. My decision wasn't to leave the next day, but my decision was to leave within the next 6 months, and I did. That was a very conscious decision. After thinking about it a lot and thinking about the options, it wasn't something that it wasn't just a knee-jerk kind of action. It was something that was very considered. Yeah.
Sort of a two-part question, but the title of the book, it's pretty strong, and I guess it explains a lot. But also, how close is that to the people who you're writing for? Like, who are you writing this book for? And how is that connected to the title?
To the title? Yeah. Well, I can explain the title first if anyone's interested. The title, is, as most of you know, All Who Go Do Not Return. it's an adaptation from a Hebrew verse. It's a slightly modified Hebrew verse. Those of you who speak Hebrew will know this. The Hasidic way or the Ashkenazi way is Kol ba'eha lo yeshuvon. Kol ba'eha lo yeshuvon. I guess in the modern Hebrew it's close enough. But the literal translation is all who come to her do not return, and it refers to a seductress, a temptress, a woman who is leading men away to sin, who is so vile, and all who go to her cannot find their way away from her. It's a verse in Proverbs. I didn't, but the Talmud says that verse refers not to a woman. It's an allegory to heresy. That those who are trapped in heresy, those who find their way to heresy is such a nefarious trap that you cannot get away from it. That's what the Talmud says. And in Hasidic culture, in Hasidic society, it is taken even further, and it refers to any kind of knowledge outside of religious sources. All who go, and so people will say that this refers to just reading a secular English book. Those of you who speak Yiddish, there are lots of Yiddish speakers here, know that the word for book is bichel, buch, but little book is bichel. And so the letters of bichel, bet, yud, kof, lamed, stand for kol ba'eha lo yeshuvon, which was a way that some attributed to the Chatam Sofer, who was a 19th century rabbi in Hungary or Austria, Pressburg. Some attributed to the rabbi of Tzanz, but who said, Bichel is the acronym of all who go do not return. Like, read the wrong books and you will leave and never come back. And then that's, it's pretty apt. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, having read the memoirs of several women who've written memoirs upon leaving the community, I was wondering if you were struck by any big differences for you as a man exiting the community, and if you wanted to bring those to your own memoir.
Well, you're asking whether I've read those?
Yeah, and if there were any large differences for you, and
right.
what struck you by reading those.
Well, there are huge differences between the male and female experiences, and certainly this is true in the entire ultra-Orthodox world, but very, very true in the Hasidic world. The Hasidic world is a patriarchal society. There's no question about that. It epitomizes a patriarchal society. But maybe almost for that reason, I think that the male experience is crucial to understanding that world, because it's a male world where things are decided and where the lifestyle is determined. Not that women don't have any kind of say in these things, but it's generally it's a male-run world, and I think the way men and boys are raised and conditioned is really important to understanding why Hasidic society is as patriarchal as it is. I think there's something else also. I think there's a lot of talk about the role of women and the place of women within the Orthodox community in general, certainly within the ultra-Orthodox community, and certainly within the Hasidic community, and that's a really important discussion to have, obviously. But I feel like there's another discussion that needs to be had, and that is how the upbringing within Hasidic society in particular affects boys and later affects men and later affects everybody they come in contact with. Boys they're not given secular education. Girls do not get anything close to adequate secular education, but it's a lot better than boys. And I would be happy if boys got what girls got, but they don't, because they're. It's important for them to commit to Talmud study as much as possible. Boys just get like an hour or two after religious studies at the end of the day of math and English. I have two boys, 13 and 15, who cannot speak, read, or write in English. They were born and raised in the United States. And I think that's a travesty. And I have three daughters who can read and write English very, very well. So this is not to say that the girls get a really good education, but this is to say that the boys are getting something that is really, really poor, and that needs to be paid attention to. There are other things that affect boys in ways. Boys are pressured to, they have to go to yeshiva from 6:30 in the morning until 9, 10 at night, young 13-year-old boys who, many of them have no aptitude or interest in Talmud study. They might want to be writers, they might want to be artists, they might want to be musicians, whatever it might be. But that's the one thing that they have to do. They're expected to sit from dawn till late night over this volume of dense, unpunctuated text in ancient Aramaic. I think there's something really wrong about that. And then they're raised. They have no marketable skills when they're 18, 19, put in a room with a girl and said, this is the one you're going to marry, whether they have semi-choice or a little bit choice, whether the parents choose, but they're given no sex education, they know nothing about sex, birth control, they don't know how to provide for their families, most of them, they have no skills. And then the babies start coming, and there's 1, 2, 3 children, and suddenly a man looks around, and he has no idea how he's supposed to provide for them. I think this is a really, really important conversation that also needs to be had, and it's a conversation around gender, but it's a different conversation from the one that needs to be had about women. And so that's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
What legacy do you hope to leave with your book?
Legacy. I hope somebody gives me an advance on the next book. That's pretty much it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Given that your title refers to like a gravitation towards heresy, or presumably that isn't how you feel about having left the Hasidic world, would you consider your journey to be a spiritual one, or an intellectual one, or just like an unburdening?
An existential one. It's certainly, I wouldn't call it spiritual, unless, certainly not in a narrow sense of spiritual. I don't believe in a metaphysical world. I wouldn't, no, it's not a spiritual. Intellectual to some degree, but intellect is very abstract, right? I mean, I can come up with a mathematical equation, or I can solve a mathematical problem that doesn't impel me to act on it. There has to be some kind of existential dilemma that makes me see, okay, here is the result of an intellectual inquiry, and now there's some kind of problem that I have, whether it's emotional, psychological, that says that because I discovered this solution, I therefore need to act in a different way. So that's an existential thing, I think. One more.
I don't know if you address this in the book, but what are the ramifications that you're going through by leaving?
I do address it in the book, and by leaving, all I can say in short, I lost a great deal. It was not inevitable. I could have been better prepared, but I wasn't prepared. I had no idea that this would happen, and there were tremendous ramifications. But read the book for that. Thank you very much.